Before there was a flag, before there was a president, before the United States even had a name, there was an idea. And there was a land, alive and untamed, stretching from oceans to mountains, rivers flowing freely, forests dense and endless. This land was not empty. Native American civilizations thrived here for thousands of years. The Iroquois, Cherokee, Sioux, Apache, and countless others lived in harmony with the land, hunting, trading, farming, and telling stories that explain the stars above. They built complex societies, rich cultures and traditions that spanned generations, with systems of governance, spiritual beliefs, and artistic expressions that reflected a profound connection to the world around them. Every river, every forest, every valley held meaning, shaping the rhythms of life and the wisdom passed from elders to children. But history was about to change. In 1492, European ships appeared on the horizon. Though Columbus never set foot in what would become the United States, his voyage opened the door to centuries of exploration, conquest, and colonization. Spanish explorers marched north, French traders followed the rivers, and the English crossed the Atlantic seeking land, opportunity, and freedom. With every ship that arrived, the lives of native peoples were disrupted, and new conflicts, alliances, and exchanges reshaped the continent. Diseases unknown to the Americas spread swiftly, decimating populations, while the newcomers sought wealth, religious influence, and power, often at the expense of those who had called this land home for millennia. In 1607, the English established Jamestown, the first permanent settlement. It was a disaster at first. Disease, starvation, and mismanagement nearly wiped out the colony. The settlers struggled to adapt to the unfamiliar environment, facing harsh winters, swarms of mosquitoes, and the complexities of navigating relationships with local native tribes. Only the intervention of these tribes, who taught the settlers how to cultivate crops and survive, and the rise of tobacco cultivation, which became a profitable export, saved Jamestown from extinction. Yet even as Jamestown endured, the seeds of a new social and economic order were being sown, including the beginnings of a plantation system that relied on forced labor. 13 years later, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, seeking freedom from religious persecution. The first winter was brutal, claiming nearly half of their number, as hunger, frostbite, and disease took a heavy toll. But guidance from Native Americans, like Squanto, who taught them how to fish, plant crops, and navigate the land, allowed the survivors to endure and establish a foothold. The first harvest brought a fragile sense of hope, celebrated in what would become remembered as Thanksgiving, a story of survival, resilience, and the complex interactions between settlers and indigenous peoples. Meanwhile, in 1619, a ship arrived in Virginia carrying enslaved Africans. Initially small in number, the system of slavery expanded as plantations grew, laying a dark foundation that would haunt the nation for centuries. Slavery became entwined with the economy, culture, and legal system, creating a society deeply divided by race and power. The arrival of enslaved peoples marked the beginning of an era of immense suffering, yet also the persistence of culture, community, and resistance that would endure despite unimaginable hardship. Throughout the 17th century, the colonies multiplied along the eastern seaboard. The English crown maintained authority, but the vast distances and unique circumstances of colonial life encouraged a spirit of independence. Town meetings, colonial assemblies, and local militias allowed settlers to govern themselves in ways that were often remarkably democratic for the time. Trade with Europe, the Caribbean, and even with distant parts of the world brought wealth and new ideas, while tensions with native tribes and competing European powers shaped the politics and security of the region. By the mid-1700s, the colonies were thriving, yet restless. The French and Indian War, part of a global struggle between Britain and France, drained British resources and led the Crown to levy new taxes and restrictions on the colonies. Laws such as the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts provoked outrage, sparking protests, boycotts, and the formation of organizations like the Sons of Liberty. Newspapers and pamphlets spread ideas of liberty, rights, and self-determination, connecting distant settlements in a shared sense of purpose and frustration. The colonies were no longer merely distant outposts. They were communities with identity, aspirations, and the beginnings of a revolutionary spirit. As the years passed, this tension grew into outright rebellion. In 1773, the Boston Tea Party became a symbol of defiance, an audacious act against taxes imposed without representation. Battles followed, from Lexington to Concord to Bunker Hill, as ordinary men and women took up arms for what they believed to be their inalienable rights. Leaders emerged, Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, shaping not only military strategy, but also the philosophical foundation of a nation. The Declaration of Independence in 1776 declared to the world that these colonies would no longer be subjects. They would be a new nation, built on principles of liberty, equality, and self-governance, even as the reality of slavery and exclusion would continue to challenge those ideals. The war was long and difficult. Soldiers endured harsh winters, shortages of food and clothing, and constant danger, yet alliances with France and the perseverance of revolutionary leaders helped turn the tide. By 1781, the British surrender at Yorktown signaled the end of major fighting, though the struggle to build a united, functioning country was just beginning. The Articles of Confederation provided initial governance, but weaknesses soon led to debates, compromise, and the drafting of the U.S. Constitution in 1787, a document that would balance power, protect rights, and establish the framework for a new government. And so, from untamed wilderness to thriving native civilizations, from European exploration to rebellion and revolution, the story of what would become the United States unfolded. It was a land of hope and hardship, of courage and conflict, of ideas that would one day grow into a nation not yet perfect, but filled with the promise of what could be, and the enduring lesson that freedom and justice are born from struggle, vision, and the unyielding spirit of those willing to shape their destiny. By the 1760s, Britain had emerged victorious from the French and Indian War, but at a tremendous cost. The war had stretched British resources thin, and the government looked to the American colonies to help shoulder the financial burden. Parliament imposed a series of new taxes, including the Stamp Act, which required colonists to pay for official stamps on documents, newspapers, and legal papers, and the Townshend Acts, which placed duties on imported goods like glass, paper, and tea. These measures sparked outrage among colonists who had grown accustomed to self-governance. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry, capturing the belief that the colonies should not be taxed by a government in which they had no elected voice. This sentiment was not just political, it was deeply personal, touching the daily lives and livelihoods of ordinary Americans. Tensions boiled over in the streets of Boston. In 1770, a confrontation between British soldiers and a restless crowd erupted into violence. Shots were fired, and 5 colonists lay dead on the cobblestones, a tragedy that became known as the Boston Massacre. The event was widely publicized and inflamed anti-British sentiment throughout the colonies. 3 years later, patriots took a dramatic stand against British authority in the Boston Tea Party. Disguised as Native Americans, they boarded ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor, protesting the Tea Act and challenging the Crown's control over commerce. The British response was swift and severe. Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston Harbor, dissolving local assemblies, and requiring that private homes quarter British soldiers. The measures were designed to punish, but instead they united the colonies in defiance. For the first time, delegates from 12 colonies came together to form the First Continental Congress in 1774. They sought a peaceful resolution, petitioning King George III for redress, while simultaneously preparing for the possibility of armed conflict. In towns and villages across the colonies, militias were formed, weapons were stockpiled, and local committees of correspondence spread information and coordinated resistance. The sense of unity that had once seemed impossible was now growing stronger, driven by shared grievances and a collective desire for self-determination. On April 19, 1775, that tension finally erupted into war. At Lexington and Concord, the first shots were fired. Historians still debate who fired first, but the outcome was clear. The American Revolutionary War had begun.
Ordinary farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers found themselves soldiers overnight, defending their homes, families, and principles. What had started as political protest was now an armed struggle for survival and liberty. The sound of muskets and cannon fire echoed across New England, marking the start of a conflict that would reshape the world. As the fighting continued, ideas of independence began to spread with increasing force. Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, published in 1776, captured the imagination of the colonists. Paine's words rejected monarchy outright and argued passionately for a government based on the consent of the people. He called for the colonies to break free from British rule, not just for economic reasons, but as a moral imperative. The pamphlet reached towns and cities from Boston to Charleston, influencing public opinion and inspiring ordinary citizens to envision a new, self-governing nation. The momentum for independence culminated on July 4, 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed. Drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson, the document boldly declared that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It stated clearly that governments exist to protect these rights, and when they fail, the people have the right to alter or abolish them. This was not merely a legal statement, it was a revolutionary idea that challenged the established order and set the colonies on a path toward nationhood. The words of the Declaration reverberated across the Atlantic world, inspiring those who yearned for freedom and setting a precedent for future movements seeking justice and equality. The years that followed were harsh and uncertain. Soldiers endured long winters, inadequate supplies, and the constant threat of enemy attack. Civilians faced displacement, shortages, and the constant anxiety of war. Yet the revolutionary spirit endured. Battles at Bunker Hill, Trenton, Saratoga, and countless other locations tested the resolve of the fledgling nation. The alliances formed with foreign powers, particularly France, provided critical support in manpower, supplies, and naval strength, turning the tide in favor of the Americans. Leadership, courage, and the willingness of ordinary people to sacrifice for an extraordinary cause carried the colonies through the most challenging moments of the war. By the end of the decade, the vision of an independent United States had moved from a daring idea to a tangible reality. The struggle for freedom was not complete. The challenges of building a government, creating laws, and uniting diverse populations remained, but the foundation had been laid. From protests and pamphlets to the roar of battle and the solemn signing of the Declaration, the revolution forged a nation grounded in principles of liberty, equality, and self-determination. It was a story of courage and conviction, one that would echo through generations as the United States began its journey into the world as a new and independent nation.
The American Army, led by George Washington, faced tremendous challenges from the very beginning. Small in number, undertrained, and poorly supplied, they stood against the most powerful military in the world. Weapons were scarce, uniforms were tattered, and provisions were often inadequate. Yet Washington understood a vital truth. Victory was not always measured by the size of one's army or the number of battles won. It was often measured by endurance, strategy, and the ability to survive long enough to outlast the enemy. His leadership was both practical and inspirational, instilling discipline, hope, and unity in men who came from farms, towns, and villages across the colonies, many of whom had never held a musket in their lives. The winter at Valley Forge in 1777 to 1778 tested the mettle of Washington's army like never before. The soldiers endured freezing temperatures, snowdrifts, and inadequate shelter. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, frostbite claimed their limbs, and disease swept through the ranks, taking lives indiscriminately. Morale was low, and desertion threatened to dismantle the fragile army. Yet despite the suffering, the spirit of determination never completely faded. Under Washington's guidance, with the aid of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian military officer who trained the troops in discipline and tactics, the Continental Army emerged stronger, more organized, and ready to face the British with renewed resolve. The sacrifices made at Valley Forge became legendary, symbolizing endurance, loyalty, and the unwavering commitment to a cause larger than oneself.
That same year, the tide of war began to turn. In 1777, the Battle of Saratoga became a defining moment in the Revolutionary War. American forces, through strategic planning, clever maneuvering, and sheer determination, defeated a significant British force. The victory at Saratoga had profound consequences. It convinced France that the American cause was viable, prompting a formal alliance. France sent troops, ships, supplies, and funds to support the revolution, shifting the balance of power and demonstrating that this struggle was no longer a local rebellion. It was a conflict with global implications. The involvement of France, along with later support from Spain and the Netherlands, provided crucial military and financial aid that the young nation could not have secured on its own. The war continued, with battles fought across colonies, from New York and New Jersey to the southern states, testing the resilience of both soldiers and civilians. The Americans faced repeated hardships, from ambushes and sieges to shortages of food and ammunition. Yet their determination and the growing network of allies kept the revolution alive. Local militias harassed British supply lines, spies relayed critical information, and communities supported the troops with whatever resources they could spare. The struggle was relentless, but it was also unifying, forging a sense of identity and shared purpose that transcended local allegiances. In 1781, the final chapter of the military struggle unfolded at Yorktown, Virginia. American and French forces, working in careful coordination, trapped British General Cornwallis on the Yorktown Peninsula. Surrounded by land and sea, with no avenue for escape, Cornwallis faced inevitable defeat. On October 19, 1781, he formally surrendered, effectively ending major hostilities in the Revolutionary War. The surrender was more than a military victory. It was a profound moment of validation for the colonies, proving that perseverance, strategic alliances, and the courage of ordinary citizens could triumph against a seemingly unbeatable empire. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed and Britain formally recognized the United States as an independent nation. The fledgling country had defied incredible odds, overcoming a global superpower to secure freedom and self-determination. Yet independence did not instantly resolve the many challenges ahead. The new nation faced the immense task of building a government, creating laws, and uniting diverse populations under a common identity. Compromises were made on issues of representation, slavery, and political power, leaving a legacy of inequality and division that would shape the country for generations. Against all odds, the colonies had achieved what many had thought impossible. The victory was a testament not only to military strategy, but also to the resilience, courage, and determination of a people committed to the idea of liberty. The Revolutionary War forged a new sense of national identity, a belief that freedom and self-government were worth struggle, sacrifice, and endurance. It was a story of ordinary individuals rising to extraordinary challenges, of leadership and vision shaping the course of history, and of a nation taking its first steps towards defining what it meant to be free.
Winning independence was only the beginning. The Revolutionary War had secured freedom from Britain, but it had not answered the crucial question: how does a nation govern itself? The first attempt came with the Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781, which created a loose alliance of states with a weak central government. Each state retained its sovereignty, issuing its own currency, maintaining its own militias, and controlling its trade policies. While this structure allowed the colonies to cooperate during the war, it soon proved inadequate for governing a growing nation. Disputes erupted over boundaries, trade tariffs, and taxation, and the federal government lacked the authority to raise revenue or enforce laws effectively. Without a strong framework, economic instability, political infighting, and public unrest threatened to unravel the fragile unity that independence had achieved. Recognizing these failures, leaders convened in Philadelphia in 1787 for what would become known as the Constitutional Convention. Delegates from across the states debated fiercely, grappling with questions of power, representation, and rights. The result was the United States Constitution, a revolutionary document establishing 3 branches of government: the legislative, executive, and judicial. checks and balances were incorporated to prevent any one branch from dominating, creating a framework designed to balance power while protecting liberty. The Constitution was a remarkable achievement, a blueprint for governance that has endured for more than 2 centuries. Yet, it was also a product of compromise. The institution of slavery was protected, women were excluded from political participation, and Native Americans were largely ignored in the new nation's legal and political framework. Liberty existed, but it was unevenly applied, limited by the social hierarchies and prejudices of the time. Despite these contradictions, the young United States embarked on a rapid period of growth and change. The nation expanded westward, driven by a belief in manifest destiny, the idea that Americans were destined to spread across the continent. This belief justified wars, land acquisitions, and the displacement of native tribes who had lived on these lands for generations. Treaties were often broken, tribes were forcibly removed, and cultural erasure became a tragic consequence of expansion. Yet, at the same time, the nation grew in wealth, population, and territorial reach. New cities sprang up, trade networks expanded, and a sense of national identity began to emerge, even amid tensions and conflicts. As the country expanded, it became increasingly complex and divided. Regional differences between the industrializing North and the agrarian South, between free and slaveholding states, and between urban centers and frontier territories created political, economic, and social tensions that challenged unity. Debates over federal versus state authority, the role of slavery, and the rights of citizens continued to dominate public discourse. The nation's growth was a story of opportunity and achievement, yet it was also marked by inequality, injustice, and struggle. Each new state admitted to the Union, each new law enacted, and each boundary drawn reflected the ongoing negotiation of power and principle in a country still learning what it meant to be free. The early years of the Republic were filled with experimentation, mistakes, and learning. Presidents like George Washington and John Adams set precedents that would shape the executive office. The Bill of Rights, ratified in 1791, guaranteed freedoms such as speech, assembly, and religion, addressing some concerns of those wary of centralized power. At the same time, economic growth and westward expansion created opportunities for innovation, trade, and the emergence of a uniquely American culture, from literature and art to political thought and public debate. The United States was no longer merely a collection of colonies. It was a nation in motion, dynamic and evolving, grappling with the contradictions between its ideals and its realities. Throughout this period, the story of the United States was one of both promise and paradox. Independence had given the country freedom, but that freedom was unevenly shared. Expansion brought opportunity, but also displacement and injustice. Governance was established, but required constant negotiation and compromise. The young nation was learning, often painfully, the challenges of democracy, equality, and liberty. The foundations laid during these early years, through the Constitution, westward expansion, and the creation of civic institutions, would guide the country for centuries to come, even as debates over inclusion, justice, and governance continued to shape its character. By the early decades of the 19th century, America had transformed from a group of colonies into a continent-spanning republic, ambitious, proud, and imperfect. Its story was a testament to vision, resilience, and the ongoing struggle to align ideals with reality. The United States had survived independence, crafted a government, and expanded its borders, yet it faced the enduring challenge of making liberty and justice truly universal. The nation's journey was just beginning, a journey defined by the tension between dreams and reality, growth and inequality, freedom and responsibility, a journey that continues to unfold to this day. By the mid-1800s, one issue overshadowed all others in the United States: slavery. It was a question that divided the nation down its very heart. In the southern states, the economy and way of life were deeply intertwined with enslaved labor. Plantations produced cotton, tobacco, and sugar, generating immense wealth for a relatively small class of landowners.
The institution of slavery was defended not only as an economic necessity, but also as a social and cultural norm, justified through laws, traditions, and even religious arguments. In contrast, the northern states were increasingly opposed to the expansion of slavery, driven by moral, economic, and political concerns. Abolitionist movements gained momentum, newspapers and pamphlets spread arguments against the practice, and ordinary citizens debated the meaning of freedom and justice. As the nation expanded westward, the question of whether new territories would permit slavery only intensified the divide. Compromise after compromise, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, sought to balance the interests of North and South, but each attempt only delayed the inevitable. Tensions grew in Congress, in courtrooms, and in the streets. Violent clashes, such as Bleeding Kansas, foreshadowed the catastrophic conflict to come. The political system strained under the pressure of opposing ideals, and the bonds that had once held the Union together began to fray. In 1861, the tipping point arrived. Southern states, convinced that their rights and way of life were under threat, seceded from the Union. The Confederate States of America was formed, and the nation descended into civil war. The conflict that followed was unlike any Americans had ever seen. Brother fought brother, neighbor fought neighbor, and the battlefields were filled with unimaginable suffering. At Gettysburg, Antietam, and countless other sites, the carnage was staggering. Over 600,000 lives were lost, making the Civil War the deadliest conflict in the nation's history. Families were torn apart, communities devastated, and the very fabric of the nation strained under the weight of death, destruction, and uncertainty. At the center of this struggle stood President Abraham Lincoln, a man determined to preserve the Union at all costs. Lincoln faced impossible choices, balancing military strategy, political pressure, and moral imperatives. In 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in rebel states were to be set free. While the proclamation did not immediately end slavery, it transformed the war into a struggle not only for the survival of the Union, but also for human freedom. African Americans, both free and formerly enslaved, joined the Union Army and Navy, bringing courage, determination, and a personal stake in the fight for liberation. The war raged on for 4 long years, testing the endurance of soldiers, civilians, and the nation itself. Cities and towns were devastated, supply lines disrupted, and the economy strained. Yet through immense hardship, the Union forces ultimately prevailed. In 1865, the Confederacy collapsed, and slavery was formally abolished through the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. The legal framework of bondage was ended, but the deep scars of injustice, inequality, and racial tension would linger for generations. Reconstruction attempted to rebuild the South and secure civil rights for formerly enslaved people, but progress was slow and often violently opposed. America had survived the Civil War, but it emerged forever changed. The nation had been tested by fire, loss, and moral reckoning. While freedom had been legally secured for millions, true equality remained elusive. Social, political, and economic divisions persisted, creating challenges that the country would continue to grapple with long after the last shots were fired. The Civil War was a defining moment, a crucible in which the United States was remade, and yet the promise of liberty and justice for all remained a work in progress. The story of this period is one of immense courage, sacrifice, and moral struggle. Soldiers endured unimaginable suffering on battlefields, leaders navigated impossible decisions, and ordinary citizens bore the burdens of war on the home front. The Civil War demonstrated both the fragility and resilience of the United States, revealing the consequences of unresolved divisions while also proving the nation's capacity to endure and adapt. From the ashes of conflict, the United States emerged stronger in principle, as yet it remained deeply scarred, carrying forward the lessons, sacrifices, and unfinished work of a generation that had fought for freedom and unity.
The 20th century transformed America in ways that reshaped the nation socially, economically, and politically. Industrialization accelerated at a staggering pace, turning small towns into booming cities, fueling factories with labor, and creating unprecedented wealth. Railroads stretched across the continent, steel mills and textile factories hummed with activity, and new inventions, from electricity to the telephone, altered everyday life. Yet the rise of industry also brought challenges: harsh working conditions, child labor, and growing divides between the wealthy and the working class. Immigration reshaped the social fabric as millions arrived from Europe, Asia, and other parts of the world seeking opportunity, freedom, and a new life. Neighborhoods teemed with diverse languages, traditions, and religions, creating a vibrant mosaic of cultures, while also fueling tensions and struggles over assimilation, labor, and civil rights. America's place in the world began to shift dramatically during the first half of the century. World War I tested the young nation, which initially sought neutrality but eventually joined the conflict in 1917. Millions of Americans served overseas, contributing to the Allied victory, while the home front saw dramatic changes, including increased industrial production, women entering the workforce, and social reforms inspired by wartime needs. The interwar period brought both prosperity and challenges, with the Roaring Twenties fueling cultural innovation, jazz, and modernism, while the Great Depression of the 1930s caused economic devastation, unemployment, and widespread hardship. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs reshaped the relationship between government and citizens, introducing social safety nets and infrastructure projects that would leave a lasting mark on the nation. World War II once again tested the United States. Initially hesitant to enter the war, the nation was drawn in after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Millions of Americans joined the military, fighting across Europe, the Pacific, and North Africa. The home front mobilized for total war, producing weapons, ships, and planes at unprecedented scales. The war effort accelerated technological innovation, including the development of radar, aviation, and the atomic bomb. By 1945, America had emerged as a decisive global power, having played a key role in the Allied victory and shaping the post-war order. The nation's economy, bolstered by wartime production, entered a period of extraordinary growth, cementing the United States as a superpower in military, technological, and cultural terms. The decades that followed were defined by tension, competition, and transformation. The Cold War with the Soviet Union created an era of fear and rivalry, influencing politics, foreign policy, and even everyday life. The threat of nuclear war loomed large, while technological innovation, from space exploration to computing, spurred both competition and progress. At the same time, the United States faced profound challenges at home. Civil rights movements gained momentum, demanding that America live up to the ideals enshrined in its founding documents. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and countless activists fought to dismantle segregation, secure voting rights, and achieve greater equality for African Americans and other marginalized communities. These struggles reshaped society, forcing the nation to confront its contradictions and expand its understanding of liberty and justice. Social, cultural, and political transformations continued through the latter half of the century. Women's rights movements challenged traditional gender roles, environmental awareness inspired activism, and debates over immigration, economic policy, and international engagement reflected the nation's evolving identity. The United States became a global cultural leader, exporting music, movies, literature, and technology that influenced the world while grappling with domestic inequalities, political polarization, and the consequences of rapid change. The 20th century was a period of extraordinary opportunity and profound challenge, marked by both progress and struggle, triumph and loss.
Today, the United States remains powerful, complex, and evolving. Its influence stretches across the globe in politics, economics, culture, and technology. Yet it continues to wrestle with inequality, social division, and the ongoing task of living up to its founding ideals. The story of America is an unfinished one, written not only in the deeds of presidents and soldiers, but in the lives of ordinary citizens who fight for justice, pursue opportunity, and imagine a better future. It is a story of resilience, innovation, and constant reinvention, a story that reminds us that the nation's strength lies not only in its power, but in the values it strives to uphold and the future its people dare to create. The journey of the United States across the 20th century and into the 21st is one of contrasts: prosperity and poverty, freedom and struggle, progress and setbacks. Yet through wars, social movements, economic booms, and political transformations, the nation has continually adapted, learned, and grown. Its history is a testament to the enduring idea that a society is never complete, that the work of building a fair, free, and prosperous nation is ongoing. And as Americans continue to face challenges, both at home and abroad, they carry forward the lessons, sacrifices, and hopes of generations past, shaping a story that is still being written with every action, every choice, and every dream for the future.